The first time I realized my life had crossed a line I could not uncross, it wasn't because of the clothes or the mirror, but because I felt relief where I had expected shame. That surprised me enough that I sat down on the edge of the bed and stayed there for a long time, listening to the house breathe around me, the soft tick of the kitchen clock carrying down the hall like a reminder that time, indifferent as ever, was still moving forward. I remember thinking that if I stood up too fast, if I tried to explain myself too quickly, even to myself, I would lose whatever fragile clarity had just settled in my chest. I had always believed that big changes announced themselves loudly. Arguments. Ultimatums. Doors slamming. Instead, this arrived quietly, like a truth that had been waiting patiently for me to stop lying long enough to hear it. My wife had not always controlled our finances. We used to joke about it, how I handled the big picture earning and she handled the details because she was better with numbers and follow-through. Over time, the joke hardened into a routine, and the routine into an expectation. It wasn't oppressive, it was practical. Bills were paid on time. Savings grew. I felt oddly unburdened by not having to decide every small thing. I told myself that was maturity, delegation, trust. What I didn't tell myself was how much I liked the feeling of being guided. That preference leaked into other parts of our life so slowly I didn't notice until it was everywhere. She planned our weeks. She set alarms on my phone and called them structure, which made me laugh and comply. When I missed workouts or procrastinated on responsibilities, she didn't yell. She adjusted. She added rules. Consequences. Not cruel ones, no raised voice, no humiliation, but firm, unmistakable boundaries. If I didn't follow through, I lost discretionary spending. If I avoided hard conversations, I took on extra chores. If I lied, even a small lie to smooth over discomfort, she insisted we stop and unpack it fully, no matter how long it took. I told friends she was the disciplined one. I told myself I was lucky. The truth was more complicated. I had spent most of my life performing a version of masculinity that looked correct from the outside and hollow from the inside. I was dependable, agreeable, emotionally literate enough to pass, but there was a persistent dissonance I could never name. I didn't want to be irresponsible or reckless. I didn't want to disappear. I wanted to be reshaped, but not erased. Held accountable, but also seen. When my wife first suggested that we experiment with roles, not sexually, not theatrically, but practically, I felt an instinctive tightening in my chest. She framed it as an exercise in honesty. What would it look like, she asked, if we stopped pretending we were symmetrical when we clearly weren't? If we leaned into what actually worked? I agreed too quickly. That should have been my first clue. The clothes came much later, and not at all the way people imagine when they hear words like a crossdressing or a transformation. There was no grand reveal, no sudden compulsion. It began with a conversation about presentation, how I carried myself, how much effort I put into appearing neutral, unremarkable. She asked me why I avoided color. Why I defaulted to shapes that hid me rather than expressed me. I didn't have a good answer, just a familiar flush of defensiveness that told me I was close to something tender. When she suggested I try wearing something different at home, it felt less like a dare and more like a mirror being tilted toward a part of myself I had avoided looking at directly. The first outfit was simple. Comfortable. Chosen with care. What struck me wasn't how it looked, but how it asked something of me: attention, presence, a willingness to inhabit my body instead of treating it like a tool. I expected embarrassment. What I felt instead was focus. That scared me. Because focus meant responsibility. It meant I couldn't keep pretending this was accidental or temporary or purely external. If I was going to change how I moved through the world, even in small ways, I had to confront why the old way had felt so constricting. My wife didn't push. That was the most unsettling part. She observed. She asked questions that were gentle but precise. How did I feel when I followed the routines she set versus when I resisted them? What emotions came up when I complied with a consequence I had agreed to in advance? Did I feel diminished or clearer? The answers were not flattering. I realized how often I had used ambiguity as a shield. How I avoided making firm commitments because they made my internal contradictions visible. Structure didn't cage me, it revealed me. And being seen, truly seen, carried a weight I wasn't sure I deserved. By the time I noticed that my reflection no longer startled me, I understood that something irreversible had already happened. Not because I looked different, but because I was paying attention in a way I never had before. To my impulses. To my avoidance. To the quiet relief that came from surrendering the performance of certainty and admitting that I was learning who I was much later than I had planned. Sitting there on the bed, feeling that relief bloom where shame was supposed to be, I knew the real transformation had nothing to do with fabric or rules or even my wife's authority. It had to do with the fact that I had finally stopped running from a question I'd been asking myself for years without listening for the answer. And I also knew, because clarity is rarely merciful, that there would be consequences for that honesty. For our marriage. For how others saw me. For how I would have to live going forward. The clock kept ticking. I stood up. The morning she handed me my first set of instructions, what she called my daily framework, I realized how completely I had surrendered without fully understanding it. Not surrender in the sense of coercion, but the quiet, insidious sort of compliance that comes from trusting someone more than you trust yourself. She had laid out a schedule down to the smallest detail: wake-up time, breakfast, meditation, work tasks, breaks, even the order in which I was to fold laundry or organize the kitchen. There was a rhythm to it, and it was hers, but she framed it as an experiment in self-awareness. I resented it at first. Resentment tastes like iron in the mouth, sharp and constant. I resisted in small ways, waking a few minutes late, skipping a meditation, adjusting the sequence of chores, but each deviation triggered a consequence: an entry in a shared journal, a small reduction in discretionary spending, a reflective conversation. None of it cruel. None of it public. None of it humiliating. And yet, after a few days, I noticed the subtle shift: resisting became exhausting. Following became clarifying. The strange truth was that I began to crave her structure, even when it pricked at my sense of autonomy. There was a moral texture to the obedience that I had never understood before. Compliance was not weakness, it was a kind of honesty. I was no longer hiding from myself, no longer excusing inertia or distraction. Every act, even the smallest, became a statement: this is how I choose to live right now, fully aware. Then came the clothes, and with them, a subtler, stranger transformation. She didn't force me into anything extreme or theatrical. No latex, no flamboyant outfits. She chose pieces that were functional but had subtle femininity: soft fabrics, gentle patterns, clean lines. I remember the first day I put on one of her selections. My body felt unfamiliar, yet comfortable. It wasn't erotic. It wasn't performative. It simply existed in a state I had never allowed myself to inhabit. Walking through the apartment, I noticed my reflection in the hallway mirror and felt an unexpected pause. My jawline, my shoulders, the slope of my arms, everything seemed the same, yet the lines of the clothing softened them in a way I had not considered. I felt conspicuously myself, and simultaneously, incongruously. And that incongruity became a lens for examining the parts of my identity I had long ignored. It was not only the clothing. She began guiding me in the details of presentation, posture, movement, voice modulation, the way I interacted with objects and spaces. Again, nothing sexual, nothing performative beyond self-respect. I learned to notice how my weight shifted when I sat, how my hands rested when I spoke, how others unconsciously responded to me. She prompted questions: how does this feel? Do you notice tension? Are you acting out of habit, fear, or choice? The answers were rarely simple. Fear and habit were deeply intertwined, like roots tangled beneath the soil. Choice required patience, and patience forced reflection, which in turn stirred self-doubt. I would spend long evenings alone, replaying moments of the day, noticing gestures, evaluating emotional responses. There was an education in self-observation I had never sought but now could not avoid. We were not alone in this process. Friends, colleagues, casual acquaintances, each interaction became a subtle negotiation of perception and identity. I learned to read their expectations, my internal reaction, and the unspoken social code that often dictated behavior. It was exhausting at times, a form of constant vigilance, but also illuminating. I became more empathetic, more patient, more aware of the complexity of human perception. One afternoon, a conversation with a coworker crystallized something essential. I had arrived in a softer blouse and a cardigan she would have described as neutral yet purposeful. My coworker commented on my appearance with casual curiosity, not judgment, and I realized that my anxiety about being judged was my own projection. I had assumed the world would react harshly, but the world often reacted with benign observation, or none at all. My internal drama had been louder than reality. This awareness bled into other areas of life. I began documenting my reflections in the journal she encouraged me to keep. Not confessions, not lists, not mechanical check-ins, but meditations on sensation, thought, impulse, and reaction. The act of writing felt like a dialogue with myself, one that I could no longer ignore. I confronted truths that had been uncomfortable for decades, my attachment to rigid forms of masculinity, my resistance to visible vulnerability, my persistent tendency to avoid accountability. There were, inevitably, conflicts. My old habits did not vanish overnight. I found myself snapping when routines were disrupted, resenting her authority when it touched nerves I had not fully acknowledged. Each incident became an opportunity for reflection, and sometimes, embarrassment. But the discomfort was instructive. It forced me to parse the difference between resentment, self-protection, and genuine misalignment. The emotional core of the transformation was not the clothing, the routines, or even her firm guidance, it was trust. Trust that honesty could exist without shame, that vulnerability could coexist with respect, that identity could be expansive without being chaotic. And this trust was fragile. It required constant attention, and it demanded moral reflection. Did I meet my obligations to her as she met hers to me? Did I allow my own fears to interfere with the truth? I began to notice subtler changes in myself. Moods shifted more rapidly, not wildly but perceptibly, in response to stimuli I had previously ignored. The small discomforts of social interaction became signals for reflection. Did I react because of ingrained habit, social expectation, or authentic preference? The ability to parse these motivations became a skill, one I had never cultivated, and one that reshaped how I lived my life. One night, weeks into this process, I caught my reflection mid-movement in the dim light of the kitchen. I wasn't shocked. I wasn't repulsed. I was curious. That curiosity was new. I had always observed myself clinically or judgmentally. Now I observed with attention, patience, and, unexpectedly, care. I realized then that the transformation had already begun at the deepest level. I was learning to inhabit my own life fully, without pretense, without concealment, without fear masquerading as rationality. I began noticing how the small, seemingly inconsequential choices revealed the structure of my own mind. Every morning, as I dressed according to her guidance, I realized that what I put on was less about external appearance than internal acknowledgement. Each garment became a prompt. Who do you want to be today, not what you think you should be? That question, simple in phrasing but vast in implication, forced me to examine the spaces I had long ignored, the silent, internal frameworks that dictated my interactions, my emotions, and my sense of self-worth. The routines she had imposed at first felt restrictive, almost oppressive in their precision. But slowly, I understood they were scaffolding, not cage bars. They were designed to teach self-accountability, to expose avoidance, to create a mirror not just for the body but for the psyche. When I woke at the exact time she had set, meditated for the prescribed 20 minutes, and prepared breakfast with conscious attention to each movement, I realized that following the schedule was not about obedience, it was about presence. I was inhabiting my life in ways I had never allowed before. The more I followed the rules, the more I noticed my own contradictions. I had always claimed to value honesty, empathy, and moral responsibility, yet I had often sidestepped discomfort, delayed difficult conversations, and rationalized small lies to avoid confrontation. These routines forced me to confront the dissonance between my self-image and my lived behavior. If I faltered, missed a step, hesitated, or shirked a responsibility, she didn't punish me with anger. She imposed reflection. Consequences were calibrated to encourage introspection rather than fear. Sometimes it was a reduction in discretionary spending, sometimes extra household tasks, sometimes a quiet conversation where I had to articulate what had gone wrong. Each instance was a test of self-awareness and ethical honesty, and each one left a residue of insight that lingered long after the surface frustration faded. The clothing, too, became a lens for self-observation. She never forced anything overtly feminine, no provocative choices, no theatrical extremes. The garments were functional, aesthetic, thoughtful. Soft sweaters, structured yet flowing skirts, shirts that hinted at shape without exaggeration. The act of wearing them created a dual awareness, first, of the body, of the way fabric draped and shifted, second, of the social dynamics my presence now evoked. People did respond differently, subtly or otherwise. Some with curiosity, others unconsciously adjusting their tone or posture. I had long assumed such reactions were proof of judgment or exposure, but they were simply feedback, information to process, reflect upon, and integrate. This awareness extended into every facet of my social life. Conversations with friends, colleagues, even strangers became exercises in emotional intelligence. I noticed how my language shifted, how tones of voice and micro-expressions influenced interpretation. I learned to distinguish between external judgment and internalized anxiety, a skill I had lacked in abundance before. More importantly, I learned to sit with discomfort without immediately reacting, something I had rarely done in my previous life. One afternoon, I recall, I was running errands when a brief interaction crystallized a profound truth. I walked into a small cafe, wearing a modest outfit she had chosen, and the barista, someone I had interacted with countless times before, addressed me differently, more warmly, though with no overt change in content. It struck me that my internal tension, the years of trying to perform a socially acceptable version of masculinity, had been palpable to others. When that tension eased, when I moved with deliberate attention to myself rather than to imagined expectations, the world responded in kind. Identity, I realized, was not only internal, it was relational, dynamically constructed in dialogue with others' perceptions. The emotional labor of this transformation was constant. Every day brought self-interrogation: am I acting out of preference or habit? Am I honest about my discomfort or am I masking it? Am I attentive to the needs of others without losing myself in compliance? Each question demanded reflection, and reflection often revealed uncomfortable truths. I had been complicit in my own self-deception for years, valuing image and routine over introspection and moral courage. The structure she imposed, once resented, now felt like a path out of that complicity. The night was the hardest part. Alone in the dim light of our apartment, with the routines complete and the journal open before me, I confronted the most intimate layers of my transformation. There was fear, yes, the fear of exposure, of judgment, of failure. But there was also curiosity, and, surprisingly, gratitude. Gratitude for a partner who could observe without shaming, who could challenge without coercion, who could enforce structure without tyranny. I began to understand that love, in its most disciplined and ethical form, required the courage to guide another toward truth even when it was uncomfortable for both parties. Then came the first real test, a social gathering I had been dreading. A close circle of friends, people who had known me for decades, some who held traditional expectations about masculinity, presentation, and social propriety. I wore a simple, thoughtful ensemble she had approved. I kept to her guidelines for posture, tone, and attentiveness. Every movement, every word, every microgesture became an exercise in honesty with myself and, by extension, with them. The initial discomfort was intense. I could feel the internal tug-of-war, habit versus choice, old self versus emerging self. Questions arose unbidden: would they notice? Would they understand? Would they judge? And yet, as the evening progressed, a remarkable phenomenon occurred. The more I focused on presence, empathy, and genuine engagement, the less my anxiety dictated my behavior. My friends responded not to the clothes or the shift in gender presentation, but to the authenticity that had been dormant, waiting to emerge. They mirrored it in subtle ways, through conversation, laughter, and attentiveness. That night, walking home with her, I understood something fundamental: transformation is not an event, it is a process of moral, emotional, and social education. The routines, the clothing, the external frameworks, they are merely tools. The real work occurs in perception, empathy, self-accountability, and the courage to inhabit one's own interior life fully. I began to see that my prior life had been defined by a kind of performance, not malicious, not intentionally deceptive, but performative nonetheless. I had presented a version of myself that was socially legible, professionally competent, personally agreeable, but emotionally compartmentalized. What I am learning now, under her guidance and through my own reflection, is that selfhood is not a costume or a role, it is an ongoing practice of observation, moral honesty, and relational attentiveness. Every morning, every decision, every interaction is a test of integrity. And while the physical aspects of this transformation, the clothes, the presentation, the posture, are visible to others, the profound change is invisible, taking place within, in the quiet architecture of self-awareness, empathy, and responsibility. The person I see in the mirror is changing, yes, but the person who sees herself, the one who inhabits her choices fully, is the truest reflection of. Transformation. The following weeks unfolded with a rhythm that was at once reassuring and destabilizing. Each day carried the familiar scaffolding of her rules and routines, yet within that structure I discovered an ever-shifting landscape of self-reflection and subtle ethical testing. The routines themselves were deceptively simple: wake at the appointed hour, maintain the order she set, follow each small protocol she had designed to encourage clarity, self-observation, and honesty. And yet, it was in the minutiae that the transformation took root, the small decisions, the unexpected impulses, the discomforts that revealed unresolved internal conflicts. I had not anticipated how exhausting it could be to inhabit my own presence with such intentionality. In the past, I had drifted through social situations and domestic life on autopilot, relying on habit and assumption to navigate both. Now, every movement, every gesture, every conversation demanded scrutiny. I observed my posture, the tilt of my shoulders, the angle of my voice. I noticed micro-expressions in others and assessed my emotional responses in real time. Every moment was a test of attention, honesty, and moral clarity. And that attention, sustained over hours and days, reshaped me profoundly. She continued to guide me with remarkable patience. The consequences she enforced were never punitive in the conventional sense, they were designed to encourage insight. A missed task might result in extra chores or a reflective entry in our journal. A dishonest answer required dialogue, sometimes stretching late into the night, where I had to untangle motive, fear, and truth. At first, I resented these sessions, perceiving them as interruptions, critiques, or constraints. But over time, I realized they were a mirror, reflecting not just my behavior but the roots of my resistance, the assumptions, the insecurities, and the unacknowledged desires that had shaped my life without my conscious consent. The clothing, too, became a form of self-education. She selected pieces that were understated, functional, and aesthetically coherent, requiring me to consider presentation in a thoughtful rather than performative way. The experience was transformative not because the garments themselves were inherently powerful, but because they forced me to inhabit my body with attention, to negotiate my own comfort, pride, and self-perception in real time. I became aware of gestures and movements I had previously neglected, of subtle rhythms of presence that communicated more than words ever could. One evening, I caught myself staring at the reflection in the hallway mirror, noting the way my posture had shifted, how my movements carried a new grace that was neither contrived nor externalized. I realized that the person I saw was not the same one who had awoken weeks before, rushing through life to escape introspection. This person, alert, attentive, accountable, was constructed through daily acts of honesty, reflection, and engagement with both self and others. The physical appearance was secondary, the internal transformation was primary, a subtle but profound restructuring of identity and moral agency. Social interactions became laboratories for ethical and emotional experimentation. I noticed how friends and acquaintances responded differently when I engaged authentically rather than performing expected roles. Some reactions were curious, some indifferent, some subtly approving. In every case, I learned to distinguish between external perception and internal truth. The anxiety I had long associated with judgment diminished as I realized that authenticity, not conformity, was the currency of trust and relational clarity. I remember a particular incident that crystallized the depth of this evolution. A friend, unaware of the changes in my routines or presentation, commented on my demeanor, noting a calm attentiveness and warmth he had not observed before. My instinct, old and reflexive, was to attribute it to mood or circumstance. But I recognized it for what it was, the product of deliberate practice, moral reflection, and honest engagement with both self and world. That realization hit with an unexpected intensity. I had become someone more capable of empathy, of presence, of relational integrity, and I had done so not by changing who I was, but by learning to inhabit my own interior life fully. The challenges were constant, and not always external. Internal conflicts, old habits of avoidance, fleeting resentment, the temptation to revert to the comfort of autopilot, surfaced regularly. When these arose, she did not criticize. Instead, she guided me toward recognition and reflection, prompting questions that forced clarity. Is this fear, or is this truth? Are you acting out of habit or choice? Do you resist because it is inconvenient, or because it is morally justified? These questions demanded honesty, and honesty, I discovered, was often uncomfortable, even painful. But the discomfort was instructive. It illuminated the areas of my life where integrity had been compromised, where empathy had been neglected, where accountability had been deferred. I also began to notice how these routines and reflections reshaped my relationship with time. In the past, moments had blurred together, tasks had been postponed, responsibilities had been delayed. Now, the structure she imposed, precise, deliberate, consistent, transformed minutes into exercises in presence and attention. Time was no longer a river in which I floated passively, it became a medium for ethical engagement and self-education. Every small act, from preparing breakfast to folding laundry, carried moral and psychological weight. The realization was subtle at first, but grew steadily. Integrity was not merely about grand gestures, but about attentive action in ordinary moments. By the fourth week, the internal change was unmistakable. I no longer experienced the anxiety I had once associated with structure and accountability. Instead, I felt clarity, focus, and a quiet satisfaction rooted in ethical practice. Even my internal dialogue had shifted. The habitual self criticism, the anxiety-driven comparison, the need to perform externally for validation, these had begun to diminish, replaced by reflective attention and moral curiosity. One evening, after completing the day's routines, I sat in the living room with our shared journal between us. We had developed a pattern of reviewing entries together, not for oversight but for dialogue. She asked questions, I responded. Occasionally we disagreed. Occasionally, I revealed uncomfortable truths. Each session was a negotiation of honesty, empathy, and accountability. By the time the journal was closed, I often felt lighter, not because the burdens had vanished, but because they had been recognized, articulated, and shared. It was in these quiet, unremarkable moments that I understood the deepest lesson of this transformation: change is not dramatic. It is accumulative, imperceptible day by day, mediated by attention, reflection, and moral rigor. Clothing, routines, guidance, these are instruments, not the core. The core is presence, honesty, empathy, and responsibility, exercised continuously, quietly, and without spectacle. And yet, the world outside our apartment continued, indifferent and occasionally challenging. I began to encounter subtle tests of my new selfhood, situations where old reflexes, avoidance, defensiveness, superficial compliance, tempted me. Some were trivial, a miscommunication at work, a friend's offhand remark. Some were weightier, ethical dilemmas in decision-making, moments of social judgment, the negotiation of relational boundaries. Each time, I was forced to confront not only the practical implications but the moral and psychological dimensions. The guidance she had provided was no longer a crutch but a foundation upon which I could exercise discernment, integrity, and empathy. By the end of this period, I realized that transformation had occurred not as an event but as an ongoing evolution. The routines, the clothing, the imposed structure, they had catalyzed change, but the true transformation was internal, a deep, ethical, and psychological restructuring of identity, awareness, and relational capacity. I was not merely inhabiting different clothing, I was inhabiting a different version of myself, one defined by attention, presence, accountability, and compassion. By now, I had settled into a rhythm that was at once familiar and continually challenging. The routines no longer felt imposed, they were internalized, like the cadence of my own heartbeat or the habitual alignment of my posture. And yet, the comfort of habit did not equate to complacency. Each day still demanded awareness, self-inquiry, and reflection. I had learned that the deepest lessons of transformation were subtle, cumulative, and often invisible to anyone but myself. One morning, as I followed her instructions for preparing breakfast, I paused mid-task, noticing the way sunlight fell across the counter and illuminated the small motes of dust floating in the air. The sight, ordinary and ephemeral, triggered an unexpected cascade of thought. I considered how many years I had moved through life without attending to such small realities, how often I had treated moments as placeholders rather than opportunities for reflection. And I understood, with startling clarity, that transformation was not about appearance, clothing, or social perception. It was about presence. It was about noticing, responding, and engaging with life ethically and attentively. She continued to guide me with patience and precision. Consequences remained, but by now they were subtle prompts rather than punishments. A missed task might result in a reflective conversation, an entry in the journal, or an extra chore. A lie or avoidance required dialogue, sometimes stretching late into the night, where I had to untangle motive, fear, and truth. Initially, I had resisted these moments, feeling exposed and scrutinized. But gradually, I recognized their value. Each challenge forced me to confront the dissonance between who I claimed to be and who I actually was. The clothing, too, remained a tool of introspection rather than spectacle. She selected items that were understated but thoughtfully chosen, encouraging me to inhabit my body with awareness and care. Each morning, as I dressed, I observed not only the way the fabrics draped but also my internal responses, the tension in my shoulders, the tilt of my head, the rhythm of my movements. I became attuned to subtle shifts in posture and presence, noticing how others reacted and reflecting on my own emotional responses. Clothing became a lens for exploring identity, perception, and self-understanding. Social interactions had become exercises in empathy and ethical engagement. Friends and acquaintances responded differently as I inhabited myself more fully and authentically. Some reactions were curious, some indifferent, some approving. I learned to distinguish external perception from internal truth, recognizing that anxiety about judgment was often a projection of my own fears rather than reality. The ability to sit with discomfort, without immediately reacting or seeking validation, became a core skill. One afternoon, a conversation with a longtime friend crystallized the depth of this change. We discussed a difficult ethical dilemma, and I found myself responding with clarity and attentiveness that surprised both of us. The response was not a performance but a reflection of internalized practice, presence, reflection, and moral courage cultivated over weeks of structured guidance and self-examination. I realized that transformation was not dramatic or instantaneous, it was accumulative, lived through daily choices, reflection, and conscious action. Evenings were the most intense part of the process. Alone or with her, I reviewed the day in the journal we maintained together. We discussed successes, failures, emotional reactions, and ethical decisions. Occasionally, disagreements arose. Occasionally, I revealed uncomfortable truths. Each session was an exercise in honesty, empathy, and accountability. By the time the journal was closed, I felt lighter, not because burdens had vanished, but because they had been acknowledged, articulated, and shared. The broader implications of this transformation became increasingly clear. I noticed how much of my previous life had been defined by habit, avoidance, and superficial compliance. The conscientious attention, reflection, and ethical practice demanded by her routines revealed the depth of my prior compromises. It was humbling, uncomfortable, and ultimately liberating. I recognized that transformation required not only observation of self but also engagement with others, accountability for actions, and courage to confront the aspects of myself I had long avoided. By the 6th week, I recognized an internal shift that was unmistakable. Anxiety over external judgment had diminished, replaced by a quiet confidence grounded in moral and emotional awareness. The old reflexes of defensiveness, avoidance, and superficial compliance appeared occasionally, but now I could identify, interrogate, and redirect them. The routines, clothing, and guidance were no longer external scaffolds but integrated aspects of a life lived with intentionality, accountability, and ethical clarity. One evening, sitting together after completing our reflective session, I looked at her and realized the full measure of what this transformation had wrought. It was not simply a change in appearance or social presentation. It was an education in selfhood, ethics, empathy, and relational integrity. I had become more attuned to my own needs, emotions, and impulses, while simultaneously developing the capacity to engage others with honesty, patience, and moral clarity. And yet, the process was ongoing. Each day presented new challenges, new choices, new opportunities for reflection and moral practice. Transformation, I realized, was not a destination. It was a continuous unfolding, lived moment by moment, action by action, choice by choice. The clothing, the routines, the structure, and her guidance were instruments, but the core of change was internal: presence, accountability, empathy, and ethical engagement with self and world. The months that followed settled into a pattern that was familiar yet profoundly new. The routines had become instinctive: waking at the appointed hour, preparing meals with mindful attention, maintaining the order of our shared space, but the internal landscape remained dynamic, full of subtle discoveries and quiet reckonings. What I had once thought of as structure or control had revealed itself to be a pathway, a framework for self-knowledge, empathy, and ethical engagement. I began to notice changes that were not visible in mirrors or reflected in clothing. Emotional clarity became a constant companion. Moments of irritation or resentment arose, yes, but they were accompanied by recognition and reflection rather than reflexive reaction. I understood, increasingly, that my previous life had been punctuated by avoidance, small, seemingly harmless evasions that compounded into ethical compromise and emotional stagnation. The routines she imposed illuminated those blind spots. One morning, as I moved through the ritual of dressing and preparing breakfast, I paused to notice a shift in my thinking. I was no longer asking, "What will others think?" or "Am I performing correctly?" Instead, I asked, "Who do I want to be right now? How do I inhabit this moment honestly?" The change was subtle, almost imperceptible to an outside observer, but to me it was monumental. Identity, I realized, was less a static label than a continuous practice, a series of deliberate, attentive choices that aligned thought, action, and moral intention. She continued to guide me, though the nature of her guidance evolved. Consequences became less about correction and more about calibration, subtle nudges encouraging reflection rather than enforcement. Missed routines or lapses in attention prompted dialogue, questions, and shared analysis rather than punishment. Clothing remained a tool, a medium for observing and inhabiting my own body, for negotiating self-perception and social interaction. Each selection she made carried the same lesson: presence and attention mattered more than aesthetics, subtlety more than spectacle. Social encounters became laboratories for understanding perception, empathy, and relational dynamics. I began to notice the minute ways in which my posture, tone, and presence influenced interactions. Friends, colleagues, and strangers responded in ways I had long failed to notice, and the feedback was instructive rather than evaluative. I learned to distinguish between judgment, projection, and authentic response, refining my understanding of myself and others. Anxiety over perception diminished as authenticity replaced performance. The journal remained central to this process. Each night, we reviewed entries together, discussing emotional responses, ethical dilemmas, and internal conflicts. These sessions were neither lectures nor confessions, but dialogues, exercises in honesty, empathy, and accountability. Occasionally, disagreements surfaced. Occasionally, uncomfortable truths emerged. Each discussion, however, reinforced a central principle: integrity is not a single act but a sustained practice, cultivated through reflection, dialogue, and deliberate choice. One evening, I reflected on the progression of this transformation. The initial days of resistance and uncertainty seemed distant, almost foreign. The discomfort that once accompanied routines, clothing, and guidance had transformed into clarity, attentiveness, and agency. I had learned to inhabit my life fully, to observe myself without judgment, to engage ethically with both self and others. The external trappings, the clothes, the routines, the structured guidance, had facilitated this evolution, but the true change had occurred internally, in the architecture of attention, empathy, and moral responsibility. I also recognized how deeply relational this transformation was. It was not solitary, it was co-constructed with her through dialogue, guidance, and trust. Love, I realized, is inseparable from moral courage, the courage to guide another toward honesty, the courage to confront oneself with integrity, and the courage to maintain presence in the face of discomfort. The transformation was both individual and shared, an ethical and emotional education enacted within a relational context. By the end of this journey, I could see myself clearly, not as a finished product, not as someone who had arrived, but as a person who had learned to inhabit her own life fully. Presence, accountability, empathy, and reflection had become habits, integrated into the smallest actions, the quietest gestures, the imperceptible rhythms of daily life. I understood that transformation is not dramatic, not instantaneous, not dependent on external visibility. It is accumulative, subtle, and continuous, realized in thought, action, and moral engagement over time. In the final months, I no longer experienced fear of judgment or anxiety over identity. Instead, there was curiosity, attentiveness, and moral engagement, a deep, persistent care for how I moved through the world and interacted with others. The routines, clothing, and guidance were no longer crutches, they were instruments through which internal growth had been nurtured, resulting in a sustained capacity for empathy, ethical reflection, and authentic presence. Sitting alone one night, reflecting on this entire journey, I realized that the most profound transformation had occurred where no one could see it, within the architecture of my own attention, the deliberate inhabitation of my body and mind, the cultivation of moral clarity, and the expansion of empathy toward others. Appearance, gender expression, or social perception were secondary, the essence of change was internal, ethical, and relational. And in that quiet realization, I understood the most important truth of all: transformation is not a performance. It is the conscious, sustained, and ethical practice of inhabiting one's life fully, honestly, and empathetically, day after day, choice by choice, moment by moment. I closed the journal, feeling a deep, unshakable clarity. I had learned to see myself, not as an image in the mirror, not as a set of social expectations, not as a role or costume, but as a being capable of presence, accountability, and moral courage. And that knowledge, more than any external change, was the truest reflection of who I had become. The journey had begun with structure, guidance, and garments. It ended with attention, reflection, and integrity. And for the first time, I felt wholly at home within myself.